10,000 square meter.
Oh.
It's quite wide.
You can move BSN there.
Yeah. Somebody told me you have to move to Serpong area.
It's nice there actually.
Yeah, yeah.
More green.
So your country is now locked down again?
No, not full lockdown, but we have some restrictions. We shall now use masks in shops. We shouldn't do that until a week ago. And there are some restrictions, but the gyms are open and fitness centers and so on, they're open. My daughter,
really?
My daughter can still go to sports indoor. So it's not so hard here, but they have already announced that if it gets worse, then there'll be more restrictions. But right now, it's not a lockdown for sure.
For how many new patients for a day?
Very few. I mean, it's not something critical, and there are very few who are in ventilators. So I think we have on intensive care only 120 or something like that, and then we have in ventilators 15, or it's not much. It's quite fine. It's the first round in the spring here in March, April. It was worse because it was all the old people, but now the old people take care of themselves. So therefore, at that time there were a lot of people who were hospitalized and also a lot of death. But now I think in general 1 to 2 persons die per day with corona, and it's still old people. I mean, still typically people who are 80 or something like that. I mean, they can't handle it always. So that's the situation here. So it's not so critical in Denmark, but in other countries in Europe, it is quite critical.
Yeah. I heard the second wave, in some country.
It is a second wave.
Yeah.
I don't know. You are still on the first wave.
Yeah, we don't know.
It will be.
Even that the first wave is not the peak. We don't get the peak.
Yeah. I mean, it can continue forever. If you don't get into the same wave, then when it's bad here, then it's good at your place, and then it's bad at your place, and then it's good here. I mean, then I really hope we can get back to Jakarta quite soon, because on the other hand, I don't want to go there if it's not safe. But we are crossing our fingers for a vaccine so that we can go there safely.
Hello, I think we can start because time is indicated 1:03.
Oke, terima kasih Bu Maya.
Ya, sama-sama.
Oke. Will Papa Hugh, will you introduce?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu semuanya. Hari ini kita mendapat kesempatan yang sangat-sangat penting sekali Bapak Ibu semuanya. Kita mendapat pencerahan dari Pak Carsten. Beliau adalah pakar di bidang standarisasi, terutama bagaimana hubungannya dengan regulasi, Bapak Ibu. Seperti Bapak Ibu ketahui semuanya, tanggal 2 kemarin, 2 November, itu Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja sudah ditandatangani, dan ini merupakan satu langkah baru Bapak Ibu, terutama sebagian daripada turunan undang-undang, peraturan pemerintah turunan Undang-Undang CK ini, terutama yang untuk kemudahan berusaha itu basisnya adalah risk-based thinking Bapak Ibu. bagaimana kita menganalisis risikonya, dari situ kemudian kita turunkan dalam bentuk standar, dan setiap perizinan berusaha nanti akan didasarkan pada standar, meskipun kita tahu bahwa standarnya masih bentuknya regulasi. Nah, ini merupakan langkah baru buat kita semuanya. Hari ini kita sangat berbahagia sekali bisa mendapatkan pencerahan bagaimana voluntary standar, kemudian ada technical legislation, kalau kita bilang technical regulation lah ya, yang berbasis standar, kemudian ada bagian yang memang dibiarkan menjadi voluntary standar. Nah, ini Master Carsten ini nanti akan memandu kita atau memberikan pencerahan kepada kita bagaimana EU itu mengelolanya, Bapak Ibu. Perlu diketahui ada sedikit perbedaan yang sangat fundamental. Kalau di kita adalah satu negara, Bapak Ibu, kalau di EU itu adalah banyak negara dengan platform yang mungkin berbeda-beda, tapi dia punya kesepakatan. Kesepakatan itulah yang diangkat dalam EU, dan itu nanti mohon dicermati juga cara mereka menggunakan teknik-teknik ini, sehingga kita bisa mungkin membuat semacam apa namanya ya, kebijakan atau barangkali semacam cara menggunakan standar ini dengan lebih baik, Bapak Ibu. Nah, saya berharap ini bukan hanya satu-satunya seminar yang kita selenggarakan, tapi barangkali nanti menjadi salah satu langkah yang akan memperkaya kita semuanya. Terima kasih Bapak Ibu yang sudah bergabung. Saya berharap Bapak Ibu dapat mengikuti webinar kali ini dari awal sampai akhir, dan semoga apa yang kita dengarkan dari Master Carsten ini bermanfaat buat kita semuanya. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Silahkan Master Carsten. Please go. Time is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to see that my team leader, he has actually signed up this morning or this afternoon. So I'll give the floor to Mark for a short presentation of himself and whatever, and then I will take over and do the webinar. Please, Mark.
Thank you, Carsten. Good to see you, everyone. Pak Wayu, good afternoon, and all participants in Indonesia. Very, very nice to see you today, most of you for the first time. And well, I've been in the team since April, and this is my first occasion to be with Carsten and yourselves in a webinar. So as I heard you speaking earlier on, well, we've been working remotely, and I am now myself, I have still not joined Indonesia. I hope that we'll soon be able to do so, and when the situation allows us. So this webinar is might be one of the last for the year, and as you know, Carsten and yourself, you will be preparing the next annual work plan, and this will, I hope that you will participate actively in this and give ideas on how to continue with or without the situation. We hope that the situation will improve in 2021, but we have to take appropriate measures to continue working and delivering services remotely, preferably in Indonesia, but might be remotely for some activities still. So this webinar is a brief So Carsten will deliver this webinar, and we hope that you have a very fruitful discussions, and wish you all the best. I will not stay the whole for the whole time. Sorry about that, but I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Now I will come to the technical part. See if I can share my screen here. Okay. Okay. Can you hear me? Just to be sure.
Yes, we can.
Yes, yes.
Super. Thank you very much. And thank you to Paveyu and to Mark for the short introduction. Even though I have been for a while in Indonesia, I still don't understand much Bahasa. So excuse me if I'm going to say some of the same things as Paveyu did, but hopefully not. Firstly, I would like to say welcome to all of you. I was glad to see that so many people have found time to listen to this webinar. I prefer in a way to have workshops or seminars where I meet people and can see their faces and we can discuss. Unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 situation, this is not possible for the time being. And therefore, this webinar is in a way to keep visible in Indonesia among the beneficiaries. And also it's a kind of a teaser so that in case you find some of the topics we are going to touch on today interesting, then it'll be on the very last slide. It's there'll be an email address where you can send requests for specific training if you think that something could be interesting to listen or to study more. So, but before I start, this is Carsten Kudahl. A couple of years ago, a short presentation why I'm able to carry out this webinar. Firstly, I'm the easy solution. I'm there. I'm key expert in on Arise Plus Indonesia, meaning that I was supposed to be in Indonesia most of the time. My background is that I have worked for many years at Danish Standards, the Danish Standardization Organization, which is kind of the sister organization to BSN. My educational background is that I have a master's degree in business law and economics. So I'm not a technician, which is actually the typical profile for a person who is an officer working in a standardization body. But I have always worked on a more strategic and management level. So therefore, my background has been quite fine for that. After I left Danish Standards, I have worked on a lot of different projects. So in total, I have worked 24 years with export quality infrastructure projects and at Danish Standards. So my experience is quite comprehensive in a way. I haven't done much else but doing this in my whole career. Since my background was a bit special compared to my colleagues at Danish Standards, I have always been the one who has been involved in new legislation, regulation of EU market, things which played a role at the time when I was at Danish Standards and where the establishment of the EU market or the internal market in EU was peaking in a way. And then, as you can see from my slide here, I have worked not in South America, but in most parts of the world. I have been working with different standardization organizations and other organizations related to quality infrastructure. The agenda today is that firstly, I will tell you a bit about the single market. It has actually two names. I mean, it's sometimes called the EU single market. Sometimes it's called the EU internal market. I think over time it has changed. In the beginning, it was the internal market, and then they changed the wording so that it's now called the single market. But it means that if you find old papers about the EU single market, then it's actually called the internal market, but it's the same we're talking about. I will present the background for the establishment of this market. Then I will dig more into what is actually the key topics today, namely the new approach directives, which is a way to regulate where you use standards to support the implementation of a legislation. I will tell you a bit about CE marking. This is one of the topics which can take several days to discuss, depending on how deep you go into this. So I will only focus on principles, procedures, tell you a bit about notified bodies, which is something a lot of people talk about when I'm out meeting beneficiaries also in Indonesia. But it's important to make it clear what are the rules for these notified bodies and where can they be established. Then we look at standards and how they support other kind of technical regulations, because it's in the use of standards to support legislation is something which has been developed over the years. And I will give you some examples of how it has been used. We will shortly, with a few slides, touch on food regulation. We have on purpose not invited people, not a lot at least, for this seminar or this webinar who are specialized into food regulation, simply because it's a totally different business in a way. But still, also in food regulation, kind of standards are used, and therefore I will just shortly touch on that. And then finally, I will come around some issues regarding the use of the European model outside the EU. Of course, when I use so many people's time for such a webinar, then it's important for me to tell you why I think it's important to you to know something about it. It's a webinar which is mainly aimed at people who are involved in standardization and public servants. And the reason why I find it relevant for especially people who are working as civil servants in your administration is that the EU system, the system where you have legislation supported by standards, it's a system which is adopted more and more places around the world. Also in the ASEAN community, legislation has been introduced for electrical and electronic products, and also for cosmetics, which is very much inspired by the EU legislation. When I worked more than 10 years ago on a project in the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta, we worked very much on the introduction of AHERE, which is this ASEAN harmonized regulatory regime for electrical and electronic products. There's one who is a bit noisy there. Yeah, okay, thank you. And it was my understanding that this was kind of a pilot for the region, that the overall ambition is to introduce similar legislation for a number of different areas. It has not happened yet, but still, when it happens, then it's good to be prepared. What is the thinking behind? And the ambition in the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint aims to have some kind of implement an economic integration, different economic integration initiatives, which are, for example, common legislation to create a single market for the 10 member states of the ASEAN community. So therefore, to be prepared and to understand. It's not only about understanding the European system so that you can export to Europe. It's also to understand that this system has proved to be a system which can be applied in many countries. And if you decide to use the formulations, the legislation in Europe to regulate your market, then of course we share legislation, and then trade will at the same time be facilitated. But it's not given that you shall do it exactly as we have done it in Europe. There are also in different parts of the world other priorities. I have just worked recently, I help people in the Arabic countries, and in these countries, of course, issues like halal and other things plays a big role. So therefore they have added to the legislation so that they can also address such issues in the legislation. Let's start to talk a bit about the EU single market, or the EU internal market. It was not even EU at that time, because we are back in the mid-80s. At that time, it was European Community, and we didn't talk about a union at that time. There were only 10 members of the EU. I'd still call it the EU. So it was a smaller setup compared to what you see today, where it's a quite powerful, economically powerful region in the world. But what was the reason why we decided in Europe to establish a market, a common market? To understand that, you shall know that we had a long recession period in Europe. Actually, from the early 70s until mid-80s, we had the longest and deepest post-war recession in Europe. It started very much with the two oil crises in 1973 and 1978 and 9, where the OPEC countries raised the prices on oil, and it had a huge impact on the economy. It also meant, for example, because of the crisis, that interest rate went up. Today we have negative interest rate in where I live. We actually, when we have money in the bank, then we have to pay to have money in the bank. It's a bit crazy. At that time, it was not unusual that interest rate for mortgages and so on were between 15 and 20%. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that people get extremely poor, because at the same time also the wages went up with the same percentage. So it was in a way a kind of a crazy economy at that time, where everything went up and went up and went up, but at the same time we became more and more poor. It also resulted in unemployment and inflation. As I've said, the prices went up, it's inflation, and we were not any longer competitive as a region compared to Japan and the United States and other EFTA countries. So something had to be done. We also looked at how the intra-trade, the intra-EEC trade was at that time, and it was poor. It was, in order to solve domestic problems, the 10 countries introduced different measures to protect their own economy. And therefore it became more and more difficult if you to sell products from one country to another in Europe. To give you an example, when we had public procurements, for example, then it was very common that you could only make a bid if you were a company with an address basically in the country where the public procurement took place. So we didn't have any competition, and without competition, prices are going up, quality is going down, and it's basically not good for economy. So we were falling behind, and especially in important areas like electrical and electronic equipment, office machinery, and information technology. Europe did not have really products which were competitive compared to, for example, Japan at that time. At that time, it was not so much computers. It was at a very early stage. But if we looked at, for example, who produced all the best TV sets and so on, it was Sony and Panasonic and all these Japanese companies, and office machinery, very much American companies like IBM and so on. So it was another time when we had a crisis. What we did, I've already said it a little bit about it. We actually established a lot of protectionist barriers to trade to protect our own markets. And we also used, for example, devaluation of our currency so that we became more competitive, but still seen in the region, it was not good. You know, when you devaluate, you are very competitive for a short period, and then the prices go up, and then you actually get into more problems. So we did a lot of short-term adjustments of the economy so that we could in a way cannibalize a bit on the other markets, but we couldn't, it was a not sustainable path we had chosen in the European countries at that time. Some of these names here, when I mentioned Thatcher and Reagan, perhaps some of you have heard about them but I grew up with these leaders of Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the United States, and they were very much, they shared ideas about what to do with the economy to support it and to make it more strong. And it was very much about strengthening the supply side. It means they should strengthen the companies so that they were more competitive, and therefore, and at the same time, there should be a deregulation. It shouldn't be so complicated to operate in the market. So deregulation was something which was really important for the Americans and for the UK. And the European leaders, the Commission, they found a lot of inspiration in this thinking. At the same time, here in Europe, we had this problem that we regulated everything. I mean, quite often it was for good reasons, but it just didn't work. I mean, for example, I have these examples of shapes of the cucumbers. There was a regulation saying that cucumbers, if they should be sold, they should be straight. Because if you have a lot of cucumbers which are a bit rounded, then you cannot put so many cucumbers in a box. So the idea about the cucumbers shape, that it should be straight because it's good for packaging and for transportation costs and so on. The idea was in a way good enough, but the way of regulating this was, in many people's opinion, ridiculous. There were also examples of areas where the lobbyists, they had a huge impact on the legislation. For a long time, it has been a problem that there were a lot of taxi drivers who were cheating their customers, and they could modify these mechanical taximeters, and in that way they could cheat. So therefore, they wanted to make a regulation which ensured that these taximeters could not be modified anymore by the taxi drivers, and in that way they could eliminate this cheating. But at the same time, there were producers of taximeters, there were business associations representing taxi drivers, and so on and so on. They all tried to make some impact on this or change this draft legislation, so that it ended up taking more than 20 years to agree on a piece of legislation for taximeters, for mechanical taximeters. And the only reason why they actually accepted the legislation at the end was that at that time digital taximeters were introduced, so the mechanical did not mean anything anymore. So it was a hopeless, in many ways, a hopeless way of regulating things, and the number of regulations, and at the same time the requirement that there should be consensus among all countries made it almost impossible to move forward. So when we look at how the situation was in 1985 with these 10 countries, then if a truck from Germany should bring a box into one of the other countries, it faced a lot of problems. I can give you an example. For example, if you wanted to export hi-fi and hi-fi equipment to France, then you had to have it tested before it could be placed on the French market. And this could only be done in a very specific laboratory with limited resources. I think it was also located in the mountains in France. And in that way, in a business where development is quite and innovation is quite quick, they delayed the import of products from foreign companies. So it was not, you can say, it was not very clear protectionistic behavior, but it was for sure a lot of small barriers we all put so that it was difficult for the establishment of some kind of free trade. So even though we talked about the common market, there was no real common market. There were 10 national markets well protected by regulations and standards which were obligatory. We had different sets of standards. At that time, there were only very few European standards. Actually, the only standards you could find in Europe, pure European standards, were for tiles, because there were some producers in Italy producing tiles who were interested in having European standards. But for all other areas, we didn't have any standards. It was national standards, the big ones, the big portfolios were especially in Germany, and it was international standards. So it was a totally different world we looked at that time. What we did in Europe was that a very powerful commission under the leader Jacques Delors decided to draft a paper, a white paper, which was called Completing the Internal Market. As you can see, as at that time we called it the internal market, and it was presented to the European Council. It means the councils are all the ministers from the different countries, from the different members. It presented it in 1985, and it was such a change that it had to be approved by all the parliaments. And actually, it was seen as a revision of the constitution, you can say, of the European Union, namely the Treaty of Rome, which was a really old one from 1957, which was still kind of a post-war, second post-war time. But this was the first time we revised the Treaty of Rome, and it has been revised a couple of times afterwards. But at that time we revised it so that it entered into effect in 1987. In Denmark and in Ireland, our national constitutions required that there was a referendum where we decided whether we would like to say yes or no to these changes in the treaty. And in both countries we ended up saying yes. In Denmark, with some modifications, we wanted to have some footnotes about what we could do in Denmark, but otherwise it was approved. One of the big things in this white paper was that while it earlier had been required to have consensus about all kind of legislation, then it was changed so that when legislation which aims at the establishment of the internal market shall be passed in the council and in the parliament, then it only requires qualified majority. And it's a huge change, because earlier it was possible for small countries like Luxembourg, they didn't do it much, but for example for Denmark, they could block legislation for the whole Europe if they disagreed. And it made the process of approving legislation extremely time consuming. So therefore, this change was a very important step towards the establishment of the internal market. We simply made it easier to make new legislation which should implement the internal market. When we look at the single market, then we decided to have 4 freedoms. The free movement of persons. It means that there should be no border control. Today we can travel around in most of the countries in Europe without showing our passport. There should be harmonization of legislation for movement of persons. And we should also have strong control of the EU borders. This is something which has been challenged a bit during the migration crisis back in 2015 or earlier, was it? So then we have free movement of services. It has been a huge challenge because in many countries, for example in Denmark, we have legislation where about let's say, for example, plumbing. You can't just do plumbing in Denmark unless you have some kind of authorization. So therefore, if a plumber from Poland or from Germany wants to work in Denmark, they have to have an authorization before they can actually operate on the Danish market, and vice versa, because in Germany they also have some requirements. It's also about, the authorization is very much based on their education and so on. So it's not easy for other people to get this authorization. Then we have free movement of capital. And finally, we have free movement of goods. And when you look at the discussions around Brexit, and this is the freedom where the UK is focusing very much, because this has for sure been the biggest success when we established the internal market, namely that it's now possible to send products without further control from one part of Europe to another part of Europe for sale. And in this, the establishment of this free movement of goods, the standards has played a huge role, and this legislation passed through the Parliament and the Council only based on qualified majority has been extremely important to make it happen. One thing was to say that now it's possible to adopt legislation based only on qualified majority. The next thing was to find a way to do it. And in one of the Directorate Generals, in this kind like the ministry, one of the ministries in the EU Commission, they developed a new approach which was adopted by the Council just prior to the presentation of the white paper on the internal market. And this new approach was a new way to develop legislation, and which should solve the problems I've told you about with this consensus about taximeters and cucumber legislation and whatever. with this new approach directives, as it was called later on, it was possible to adopt legislation where you only focused on harmonization on the safety matters. You should not go into details, technical details about taximeter and discuss what shall be done here to ensure that we cannot cheat on it. It was another kind of legislation where we only focused on the harmonization of the safety matters. This is what we later on called the essential requirements. And then at the same time, standards should be developed by private standards organizations on European-wide level, and they should develop European technical standards. If these standards should support European legislation, European new approach directives, then they would be called harmonized standards. But this word was not even invented at that time when they presented the new approach paper. So this was a new thing, that they introduced legislation only focusing on overall matters, and then they used standards developed by private standardization organizations. And these private organizations we are talking about were quite small. CEN and CENELEC were really tiny organizations at that time. CENELEC was a European standardization organization for electronic standards, or standards for electronic products. It's kind of the sister organization to IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission. And then we had CEN, which was a sister organization to ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. But as I told you earlier, both CEN and CENELEC had very few standards. So they have been strengthened a lot since the mid-80s, because suddenly they got a huge task, a huge mandate also to develop standards which should support European legislation. So let's dig into it and find out what kind of directives and so on we are talking about. As I said, the key elements of the new approach was the essential requirements, the references to standards, and also the conformity assessments policy, which was introduced at the same time. What is special about the essential requirements is that they specify the desired outcome to be achieved without specifying how it should be achieved. This was something some of the countries did not have any kind of tradition for. If you look, for example, at Germany, Germany had the famous DIN standards, and DIN standards, they were all descriptive standards, meaning that they describe in details how to develop a product. If you want to develop a new product, then it was more like a recipe. It was mostly like a recipe. With the new kind of thinking here, we look at performance. We don't care how things have been done as long as the objective is achieved. This was the same thinking you found in the essential requirements. So when you look at a certain kind of product, then it said that, for example, if you had to deal with electrical products, then the electrical products should be ensured that you couldn't get electrical shock if you used them. But how it was achieved, it's up to the producer, up to the manufacturer to decide. So this was the new thinking. If it had been written into a German standard, they would for sure have said that then it shall be wrapped into so much plastic in 2 centimeters, and it shall be covered, and you should not be able to put in your fingers and whatever. All kind of very specific descriptions of how to achieve what you want. But we changed the thinking at that time so that you can do what you want as long as it is safe. Then there should be references to standards. And these standards should be developed in the private system. It means that it should be developed by the interested parties, representatives from private organizations, from companies, from institutions like also universities and research institutions, from public institutions or public authorities who had interest in the specific standards. All these experts should be sitting around the same table and agree on how the standards should be developed and how the standards should look like. And these standards should stay voluntary. So what is mandatory when you use the new approach is only the essential requirements. The standards you use to show that you comply with the requirements in the essential requirements are voluntary. And we can come back to that later on, but just to give you a little idea about how this is sometimes used in the wrong way, is that in some countries I've worked in, it is quite common that they use the standards, make the standards mandatory. In that way, they in a way live up to the WTO, the World Trade Organization's technical barriers to trade agreement, because it says that you shall align your technical regulation with standards, with international standards. And what can be better than to simply take the standard and make them mandatory? But doing that requires a lot, because then it means that you have to follow your international standardization work all the time. And every time they change the standard you have made mandatory, then you have to change your legislation. Otherwise, an obsolete or an old standard is actually mandatory in your country. So in this way, by having only the mandatory requirements in the essential requirements and the standards, they remain voluntary, then the standards can be changed over time, and new ways of complying with the essential requirements can be introduced. So therefore, it's more dynamic way of doing it by having these a mandatory part and the voluntary part. Finally, there was a conformity assessment policy which was introduced, and it required that at least some of the products placed on the European market should have CE mark. I'll come back to what kind of products we're talking about. Now I'll just have a quick look. Sorry for. Essential requirements. Essential requirements are requirements that must be met for a product to be placed on the market, and they are mandatory. These requirements define the result to be attained or the risk to be dealt with, but they do not specify technical regulations. This is the first part. I think I've been around that. If I give you an example here, machineries are covered by the Machinery Directive. And in this Machinery Directive, they address exactly the hazards you find in machines. So it says that the manufacturer of machinery or his authorized representative must ensure that a risk assessment is carried out in order to determine the health and safety requirements which apply to the machinery. The machinery must then be designed and constructed taking into account the result of the risk assessment. As you can see, it doesn't say anything about standards, because it shall actually be possible to carry out this assessment of the risk without any standard. Standard is an offer, but when these new directives were introduced, most of them in the early 90s, then there were no standards. So the manufacturers had to go through this process of assessing the product and find out if there were any hazards in it before they actually affixed a CE mark and placed it on the market. And they should take into account that all kind of foreseeable misuse, that hazards can be generated by the machine, identify the hazards that can be generated by the machinery and the associated hazardous situations, and they should estimate the risk. Let me show you some examples. It's a lawnmower. It's a big one, and it's basically a safe machine. But still, 1 or 2 persons are killed in Europe every year by a lawnmower. And the reason why they are is that they use it on steep hills. And then it turns around, and the one who is handling it, or the operator, he is squeezed under it, or perhaps he's even killed by these propellers you have under it. So you can't, if you produce a lawnmower, you can't foresee that if they do something which is extreme. But you must foresee that people, perhaps if they say you can go up on this hill with certain percentage of steepness, then you must foresee that some of them, they will go a little further. So you must produce or design your product so that it can actually go a little further than these percentage, perhaps 20% it can hill. Perhaps it should be able to manage 30%. In that way, you are also foreseeing misuse. I mean, when you don't follow the instructions of the product. Identify the hazards that can be generated. It's the idea about many of these handheld tools are that there are 2 switch offs on the machine, so that if you lose the grip on one of the switches, then the machine stops. In that way, you can ensure that you can't put your fingers close to the saw while you are using it. But if there are 2 men who are using it, then one has his fingers free and he can put them close to the saw, while the other one, he can handle the tool. But you must foresee that this will happen, and therefore you can do a lot to cover the saw. And this is what you can see on this machine, that they have been thinking about how can we eliminate these extra risks if 2 people are handling the same machine at the same time. I remember when I was in standardization, the standard for such a machine here was developed, and actually the British representative in the committee, or in the overall committee which approve all standards, he was not pleased with the standard for this, because he said farmers, they do things which are not always so smart. They use tools in the wrong way. So if they can step up on something, they do it. So therefore, he said that if you have a standard for such a machine, then you shall not have any place to step on, so that you can step on the top of the machine, and perhaps it can break down and your feet ends up in this rotator, which is making this wood to small pieces. In the beginning, while the machine is new, it's no problem. It will be strong, but after a while, it will have some corrosion and it'll be weak. So he said that standards should be designed so that people could not stand up over this rotator where they cut the wood. So this is it was a situation where the other members in the technical committee disagreed with the UK. So the standard was approved, but still I can follow the thinking that couldn't we do something in the design, or some requirements to the design which ensured that people could not stand on the top of such a machine. It was approved anyway, this standard, but this is an example of how to identify the hazards that can be generated. And the UK people, they felt that they had identified something, and they may be right. One day there may be accidents with such machines because of people standing on them. So this is what you should think of when you design a machine. And then you should estimate it. You should not think about everything. If the probability that they are standing up there is very low, let's say it's 1 or it's 0, then you probably don't have to do anything unless the impact is very serious, I mean very severe. Then you may do something. So the thinking behind the risk assessment when you have a product is that if the probability is low and the impact is low, don't do anything. You don't have to think about everything, but if the probability is medium high but the impact is very high, then you're up in the red. Then you're perhaps on this number 6 in red. Then you have to do something. Then you have to think about how to design your machine so that that the risk or the probability of an accident is minimized. Then finally, we have harmonized standards. In the new approach directives, it's foreseen that the European Standardization Organization, CEN and CENELEC, are developing standards based on a request from the European Commission. These requests were, now today they are called requests, earlier they were called mandates, was a kind of an order or from a customer, the Commission, to the Standardization Organization, CEN and CENELEC, to develop a standard which offer technical solutions to meet the essential requirements. So, and these standards, when they were approved by the EU, by the Commission, then they got, they were published in the European Commission, by the European Commission in the official journal, and they were called Harmonized standards. Harmonized standards has a kind of special status. When you look at European standardization today, there are perhaps 24,000 standards. Only 8,000 of these standards are harmonized standards. So we have a lot of standards in Europe which are just normal voluntary standards. And then we have these harmonized standards which has a special status. Because when you use a harmonized standards, when you develop a new product, then you can be sure that you also address all the essential requirements in the relevant directive. This is the whole key. When you look into the harmonized standards, I will come back to that, it's not necessarily all the requirements in the standard which shall be fulfilled to comply with the essential requirements, but I'll come back to that later on. And later on is right now, actually. Because when you look at the standards, the harmonized standards, they are developed under the same set of rules and principles as other European standards. And the good thing is today that the rules for development of standards in the European system and in the international system is basically the same. In Europe, we have internal regulations for development of standards. In ISO and IEC, they have ISO and IEC directives. But when you look at them, it's only small deviations you see, and it's mostly because of the closer relationship we have to the legislators in Europe, which has to be reflected in the internal regulations. But otherwise, they're similar. But one thing is very important when we look at harmonized standards, and it is that in a harmonized standards, you have an annex. In CEN standards, it's all these standards which are a bit similar, cover the same areas as ISO. In CEN standards, you have an annex ZA. And in CENELEC standards, you have an annex ZZ. These standards, the reason why they have got these numbers, it is that they are supposed to be the very last annex in the standard. you ensure that by using set. In these annexes, you will find what requirement in these standards shall be fulfilled to comply with the essential requirements. You find the list, and it means that if you go into the standard and find 10 requirements which shall be fulfilled, for example, for an elevator, for a lift, then there may be only 6 of them which shall actually be fulfilled to comply with the essential requirements in the lift directive. Why do we have this difference between the requirements in the standards and the requirement in the legislation? That's the reason is that standards are developed by interested parties, and it's dominated by private companies. Big companies like Kone and similar lift producers, they have their own agenda when they go into standardization. They want to have as many requirements as possible so that they ensure that the Chinese producers do not have a chance on the European market. So therefore they put in a lot of requirements, for example, to something about how to make it hygienic. Hygienic, it's not an essential requirement that it's hygienic. It's not an essential requirement for a lift in the lift directive. Yeah, I can see that somebody has raised his hand. We are so many. I'm afraid that we have to take questions afterwards or on email, and then I'll do everything I can to reply on them. But I think simply we are running out of time if we shall start answering. If I shall start answering questions, it was just a comment. Thanks. But then in these essential requirements, there may be 6 out of 10 requirements relevant. Sorry. I cannot hear anything. Sorry. Okay. I think we should try to make it one way. I'm sorry. The limited time. I know it'll be monotone to listen to me for 2 hours. So, and if we make it even longer, then it can be a bit tiring for all. No, but to finalize about the annexes, you will find out that these standards quite often have more requirements than is actually needed to comply with the essential requirements. So it's only the needed requirements in the standards which are listed in Annex ZA. This is what makes a standard, a harmonized standard, special. It's also for people who are not used to use standards. If they say we shall of course live up to the harmonized standards, then they make a reference when they buy a new lift, a reference to the standard. In that way, they include all 10 requirements in the lift standard. And what does it mean? It means that they actually have more requirements to the product, to the lift, than is actually needed when you look at health and safety and environment, which is addressed in the essential requirements. So therefore, it's important when you make references to standards, for example, in connection with public procurement, that you only use reference to the essential requirements. Otherwise, you can be sure that Chinese producers and other producers from other countries, they cannot compete, because this is not their focus. The Chinese lifts are totally safe and they live up to all the European requirements, but they may not have the extra 4, comply with the extra 4 requirements which have been introduced. So this is an important thing to know about harmonized standards. Always look into the annex to find out how many of these requirements are important to us to comply. If you look at a chainsaw, there is a harmonized standard for a chainsaw. What is important in the harmonized standard is not the color. But what is important is, for example, that it's held by two hands. So if you lose the grip on one of them, then the chain stops immediately, like in the same second you lose it. This is something which is important. There may be other things like how much noise it makes, and which is important too. But there can also be other very specific technical issues which are put into the standard, but not necessarily important for the health and safety of the use of this of such a machine. There is also a standard for table saw. There are actually a couple of standards for table saws. It's a very dangerous machine, and here you can see how there are a lot of things, both with regard to ensure that she cannot cut her own hand, but also it also take away all the dust or the you have from using it. It is taken away from this by this tube you can see in the top of the picture. So these things are for sure included in a standard because it's an environmental or occupational health and safety issue to ensure that the users do not get dust into their eyes when they use it. When you look at what kind of standards or what kind of products shall be CE marked and what shall not, then the classical CE marked products are all non-food products, and they are product areas which are where you have some kind of tangible products. It's toys, machinery, electrical appliances, pressure equipment, construction products. Construction products was a difficult one to agree on in Europe because construction products are very much dependent on where they are used. When you use a brick, for example, in a house, then the requirements to the brick differs depending on whether it is a a one-floor small house for a family in Denmark, or it is for a very tall building. The pressure on the brick is very different depending on where you use it. Another thing which plays a role is in which country it is used. In Finland, in the northern part of Europe, we have a lot of snow. It means that the roof shall be made, that can be constructed in a way so that the load of snow can be really heavy without resulting in a roof breaking down. This has to be taken into consideration when you develop standards and so on, and develop or have a product. In Greece, where they have earthquakes, it's another thing. So construction product is a bit difficult to deal with, but still it's a product today which is CE marked, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily suitable for all markets in Europe, because the requirements are adapted to the specific needs in a specific area. As I said, snow in Finland, earthquake in Greece, it has to be different. And then there are a lot of products without any CE mark: chemicals, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, foodstuffs, packaging material. These areas are areas which actually where they use standards to support the legislation, but there is no requirement for CE mark of this kind of products. I will allow myself to have a 4 or 5 minutes break so I can have a little water, and then we'll come back. I will start again in 5 minutes. I hope it's okay with all of you. I think that it also gives you a chance to go to toilet or whatever you need to do. And then I'll be back in exactly 5 minutes and continue fresh in my head again. Thank you, and see you in 5 minutes. Okay, I think I will continue. If some of you are still away from your computer, perhaps you can hear me, otherwise you must come back when you're ready. I think we still have time to end at on time, but I don't want to push it more than necessary. So let's continue. Conformity assessment by using harmonized standards. What is special about these harmonized standards is that they provide solutions for compliance and presumption of conformity with the essential health and safety requirements in the directives. Presumption of conformity with the essential health and safety requirements is a key word when it comes to harmonized standards. Because what does it mean? It means in practice that if you use a standard, then you can be sure that you actually also comply with the EU legislation. The risk, if you don't do it, is that you oversee some kind of important element. And then we have other legislation in Europe, which is also, I'm sure, exists in Indonesia about product liability and so on. And then you can actually be brought to court if somebody hurts themselves by using your product. So your case, in case you have some kind of hazard, some kind of, perhaps even people who are killed by using a product you have produced as a manufacturer, then your case is much better or much stronger in the court if you have used harmonized standards instead of trying to invent a solution, a safety solution for your product based only on the essential requirements. So it is a way. But it still says presumption of conformity. It doesn't say 100% sure that you can comply with the essential requirements. Presumption means something like 99.9%, but you cannot be 100% sure. But what is important to remember is that the standards remains voluntary, and the manufacturer can still choose, if he wants to follow the standards or to do another way to show compliance. As I've said earlier, I have seen many countries where they make direct references to standards. And as I said, the advantage is that then you are sure that your legislation, actually the standard, complies with the World Trade Organization Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, because it says that you shall try to align your legislation with international standards as much as possible. But you also make standards mandatory. And the problem is that if you do so, you should know that standards, they are not always written as a legal text. There are some flexibility in standards in the way you formulate. It's nice if you can make everything black and white in a standard, but sometimes it has a tendency to be formulated as a kind of recommendation. And then it's not necessarily easy to use as a legal text. So when you make references to standards, you should be very careful whether the standards is actually suitable for this, for such a reference. And at the same time, and it's perhaps the most important one, it requires a lot of updates of legislation when the standards are revised. Because every time you change a standard in the international standardization community, a standard which has been used as a mandatory, has been done mandatory in a specific country, then this country has to revise it. Otherwise, it has, at least for the domestic companies, one standard which is old and obsolete to follow, while when the same companies want to export to other countries and shall perhaps comply with the international standard, then they have to change their product so that it complies with international standard, which is valid. So it is a dangerous way to go if you make direct references to specific standards. Now we shall hear a bit about CE marking, the principles, the procedures, and also discuss notified bodies. CE marking and especially actually notified bodies are quite often given a lot of attention because in many projects they said it would be great if our laboratory could be accepted as a notified body. We are sitting here in Abu Dhabi and we have a lot of export to Europe and it would be great. It's not possible, but I'll come back to that later on so that you know the rules. The philosophy behind the conformity assessment system in Europe is probably very similar to what you see in other parts of the world. It says that the conformity assessment requirements are increased when the risks are higher. Let me give you an example. In Europe, we have a medical devices directive. We have actually a couple of medical devices directive for different kind of products, but one of them, the general one, covers a lot of different products. If you take a very simple product like cotton bud. Cotton bud is one it's to clean your ear. It's a very simple medical device product. It's a low risk product and it requires very few conformity assessment procedures to be ready for the market. If you take another kind of product like a pacemaker, also a medical devices product, but a pacemaker is crucial. It's crucial that it works and it works all the time. Otherwise, the patient may die next time he has problems with his heart beat and it shall work. So for such a product, the risk is high and therefore the conformity assessment requirements are high. I'll try to illustrate it later on how it works. But what is common, no matter if it's a simple product or it is a very advanced product, is that you shall go through these 6 steps. Firstly, you shall find out which CE directives. And CE directives are these directives which I mentioned earlier, like machinery and electronic, low voltage products and pressure equipment and so on. Which CE directives apply to your product? It's rare today that you find products which are only covered by one directive. Quite often they are covered by several directives. If you take a simple product, which is not so simple anymore, like a hospital bed. A hospital bed is a medical device. It covers by the medical devices directive. At the same time, today, it has communication equipment on. It means that it's also covered by this directive, which is called radio and telecommunication, RTTE directive. It has also an engine so that you can get up with your head. There's a little machine bringing your head up so you can sit up in the bed. It means it has a machine, it's covered by the machinery directive. And this machine does not go on air. You have to put electricity on it. So it's also covered by the low voltage directive. You have to find out all the directives which are actually covers your product. And then you shall ensure that you comply with the essential requirements in these directives. So this is actually the next step. Then you shall find out all the essential requirements relevant for your product. Then you shall determine whether there is a need for a third-party certification. Third-party certification, when it comes to CE mark products, it's a requirement for a notified body. Then you shall assess the product conformity. It means that you shall assess whether it is complying with the essential requirements. And then you shall, based on that, you shall create and maintain a technical documentation, the technical file, it's quite often called. In this technical file, you shall have description of how the product is designed. If there are some electrical things in it, you shall show by very detailed documents how things are designed in this electrical part. And all these papers are put into a technical file. This is the file the market surveillance authorities can ask to see in case the product suddenly creates some kind of accidents in the market. Then they want to know, have they actually taken into account all these essential requirements? Have they respected the requirements in the standards they have used, and so on and so on? Because there may be special situations where something totally unforeseeable has come up with a product, but otherwise this is a documentation that you have taken all possible steps to minimize the risk when people use your product. And then you make the declaration of conformity. This is the end product when you have gone through this process. The declaration of conformity is basically it's the same, no matter if the product is advanced or it's simple. There may be a few more words to write when it's a pacemaker compared to a cotton bud, but still the declaration of conformity is kind of the declaration from the manufacturer that now this product is safe and it can be placed on the market, and I can affix a CE mark. Who is responsible for the CE mark? When it's one who is living in the European Economic Area, then it's a manufacturer. If the company that manufactures equipment for its own use, putting it into service, it's not so unusual that you have, for example, in Denmark, we have a well-known company which is called Lego. Lego, they develop a lot of their robots and so on themselves because they know what they want, and they. But these products are shall also be CE marked before you can place them in a production area, because they should be safe for the users, for their employees. So a company that manufactures equipment for its own use and to put it into service, they shall also CE mark the products. The importer of products outside the EEA, it means that if we receive products from Indonesia, from China, there is an importer here in Europe, and he is responsible for the CE mark. It does not mean that when he gets toys from China, that he sit and put the CE mark and everything. It's done in China, but he is responsible. He's a legal person which can be sued in Europe in case the product is not safe. The importer of second-hand equipment to be placed on the European market for the first time, second-hand shall also be CE marked. We cannot just say, okay, this product has been used before and it means that it's probably okay. Now we introduce it on the European market without CE mark. This is not allowed. Even if you have, for example, some table where you have all your electrical, the management of the control of the electrical system in your house, if you rebuild it, then it is also, and it's an old one which was not CE marked originally because it was established or made before 1985 or something like that, or perhaps a little later. If it was an old one and you remake it or you update it, then you have to affix a CE mark. And then a private labeler who represents himself as being the producer. It's sometimes you see that products produced in another country, perhaps in China, but then they come to Italy and the Italian, he said, this is, I present this product as my own with my own label. They are also responsible. This is the old modular conformity assessment system in Europe. I will also present the newer one, but I think this is nice and simple and understandable. Low risk products, cotton bud, it's module A. High risk products, it's module like pacemaker, module G. It's so-called full assessment of all risk, full quality assurance system implemented. But the idea here is that most products, and we are talking, for example, for toys, like 99% of the products, of the toys products placed on the European market, they only require module A, which is a very simple one, which covers design and production states, and it requires an internal production control system. Internal production control system sounds very much like ISO 9000. It is not. It can be much more simple. ISO 9000 has become quite advanced in the later versions, where it shall take into account strategies and so on. This is not the requirement for module A. Module A is a very simple quality assurance system. You have to cover both your the stages where you design the product and when you produce it. As I said, toys, 99% or more are covered by module A. An area many people believe is dangerous, like electrical products, they are also 95% or more are also module A. It's not a lamp or a computer, or perhaps a computer, I don't know about computer, it has other aspects, but many electrical products are covered by module A. So you actually find the majority of all products, they are in module A. It's only a few directives where you really find, where you think this is high risk. And it's, for example, pressure equipment. I mean, when you have a tank which is under pressure, then it's very important that the welding of this tank is done in the right way. So therefore, otherwise it can explode like a bomb. So it's an area where it's considered to be high risk, and you have to go down. When you go down in this system to module B, combined with module C, D, E, or F, then you have a type testing under module B, and then it is combined with different quality assurance systems in the production phase. I will not go into details about this because it's one of these areas where we could have a full day and have a lot of examples, but the thinking is that the manufacturer himself find out, when he goes through these 6 steps, find out what kind of conformity assessment system is required for my product. If you go into the machinery directive, you will see there is an annex, I think it's Annex 5. In Annex 5, you have a list of products which require conformity assessment procedures which are not A. But otherwise, all other conformity assessment, all other products, they are actually covered by module A. So and this list you have in the machinery directive, it's not long. I mean, we're talking about 15, 20 different kind of products. They shall be, in these ones, you shall involve a notified body, and you shall do some more, carry out some more procedures or quality assurance procedures to ensure that the product is safe before you place it on the market. This system here, which worked for many years, was revised in 2007. So it's already quite old. I don't think it would be more revised. But over the time, they have found out that there was a need for some kind of different variances of this of some of the modules. So module A has also an A1 and an A2. Still quite simple, but it is somehow adapted to the needs in the market. The same with module C and D and E and F. They have also got some extra. But the whole philosophy is still the same. You have a design phase and you have a production phase. And the design phase is very much about, at least including B, it's very much about type testing combined with something. When you come to all these, to the last couple of modules, then we are dealing with really high risk products like the pacemaker, or you have some unique products where we only produce one of these products or two of these, and then you have a module G or H, I can't remember now, which is designed for a process which is only supposed to be used once. So this is the modular conformity assessment system, which is important to understand if you export this kind of products which will be CE marked to Europe. It's at the same time a system which also has been inspired many other countries. I have, as I said, worked a bit in the Arabic countries and helped them there, and they have also in their system found inspiration in this modular system. Then we have the notified bodies used when you are in module B, C, D, E, F, G, H. A notified body can offer its services inside or outside the EU. It means that I have worked in a notified body. Danish standards had a notified body for medical devices. So when I worked there, we offered our services to American companies exporting medical devices to the European market. So we were very much active outside Europe. Then there are a number of requirements to the notified bodies. They should be non-discriminatory, transparent, neutral, and impartial. If you come from the accreditation world, then you will recognize many of these words, because these are exactly the words you use for accredited bodies like laboratories and certification bodies and so on. And this is also the case for notified bodies. Notified bodies are in practice always accredited to ensure that the whole the setup of the organization ensures that it's non-discriminatory, transparent, neutral, and impartial. You cannot have a notified body in an organization which at the same time as they are notified body also approves or are involved in certification of or CE marking of products produced in another part of the same organization. They must employ the necessary personnel with sufficient knowledge and experience to carry out its task according to the laws. Here, there is a little add-on compared to what you see in a typical accredited laboratory. Here, they also say that besides being good at the technical part, you should also know, if it's medical devices, you should also know the laws, the relevant laws. It means the medical devices directives, so that you can apply the requirements when you carry out your tasks as a notified body. You must ensure that there's confidentiality on the information obtained in course of the conformity assessment. In our case, when I worked at Danish Standards, we simply had had a system where only people with a specific card, they could get into the area where all these files we had for different companies were stored. So there are a bit more strict requirements here compared to a normal accredited certification body, for example. And they must provide information to the notifying authority, the market surveillance authorities and other notified bodies if it's needed. The market surveillance authorities may, in certain cases, have to contact the notified bodies to ensure that they have actually been involved in the approval or the CE marking of a product. Then there is something which is important, especially if you discuss on the projects which take place outside Europe. It's important to stress that you cannot have a notified body in Indonesia, for example, or in China. They should be established under national law and have legal personality. National law is in this case understood as European law. So a notified body shall be established in Europe and it can operate outside Europe. But it also means that if you need a notified body to approval of a product which is produced in Ukraine or not, you have to pay extra because of course it costs money if you have to request services from Europe. But sometimes it's also possible simply just to send products to test in Europe, and then you send back the product and the test report, which shows that you are complying with the requirements. So it's not like necessarily something which is extremely expensive, but of course it costs extra money that you cannot go down to the nearest notified body and have your products checked. And then you have requirements which are very similar to what you find in normal accredited bodies, that they shall operate to the highest degree of professional integrity and technical competence. And they shall be a third party independent of the organization of the product it assesses. Earlier, it was actually possible, I've seen that in a job I had earlier, that a producer of Windows was a notified body for approval of Windows. And at the same time, this notified body was actually a department of a Windows producer in Europe. This is not a possibility any longer, but it was actually possible earlier, but the independence was difficult to prove, and therefore it is not, it's not possible any longer. And then they shall take out liability insurance. Again, my experience from Danish standards, it is shall cover huge losses. I mean, when you cover medical devices on the American, produced in America and placed on the European market, then you never know if the same products are sold on the American market, and you have some kind of if you are involved in some kind of legal case because of if the product is unsafe. So this is something they also require. When you look at CE mark, just take your computer you are sitting with now. There's probably a CE mark on many of them. Then you can see whether a notified body has been involved in the approval or the CE marking of the product or not. If they have been involved, then they will put on their number, because all notified bodies have a number. And this is, as you can see here on the left side, a CE 0086 or 000123. These two CE marks have been applied on products supported by a notified body. For many of the products, lamps, simple products, you will see that there is only a CE mark. It means that the product has been covered by module A and that it did not require any kind of involvement of a notified body. If you take this notified body number 0086, then you can see that it is actually BSI Assurance UK, which is in Milton Keynes in London. They are located, and they have the notified body number 0086. You find all these standard or these notified bodies in the NANDO database, which is a database published established by the Commission. So if you search NANDO database, I'm sure it will pop up. It is very much used by the market surveillance authorities, because you will, of course, there is always a risk of fraud when people it is so easy to affix a CE mark. Then there is also a risk that there are some fake ones, and if they feel, the market surveillance authorities feel that there is some fake CE marking here, and it's perhaps also even with a number of a notified body, then they can actually go to the notified body and ask them, have you helped this company with the CE marking of this specific product? And if they say no, then you know that this is a fake CE mark. So it's important to track who they have used, that you use this number and go into the NANDO database and find out where they are. At the same time, the NANDO database is also a way to find out what kind of service providers do you actually have access to for your specific product. So if you are a producer of construction products, for example, then you can find out which notified bodies do we have for construction products with a scope which covers our specific products. The free movement of goods was not only ensured by the new approach directives I've mentioned earlier, all these for machines and medical devices and so on. There are also other areas which over time have been regulated. One of the well-known one is REACH, the REACH directive, which regulate chemical substances, and it has a huge impact, or it's very important to companies exporting to Europe, because if the product has some kind of chemicals, then you have to register them in a database in Finland, I think it is. But this REACH directive, it's also supported by standards, even though chemicals shall not be CE marked. But they have found inspiration in the new approach system, where we say we cannot continuously change the directive every time a new chemical substance comes up or a better test method is invented. So therefore, to support the REACH regulation, you can actually use these standards which shows the right test methods. So this REACH regulation is supported by standards. The same with cosmetic products. It's actually only one standard, but it's about good manufacturing practice for cosmetics. There is a specific standard for that. And this is a way also to show to the producers that if you want to ensure that the product has a same kind of level of safety and health level as it should have always, then you can use the GMP standards for cosmetics. Finally, actually one of the first directives which used standards to support its implementation after the more traditional ones. The first one was the packaging and packaging waste directive, which has a number of standards for reuse, recycling, requirements and tests. All these standards are recommended to be used by producers of packaging and packaging waste so that they comply with the requirements in the packaging and packaging waste directive. Finally, we have the same system, but not use of standards in eco-design. Eco-design has become very important. All this energy labeling you will see on your refrigerator, on your stove, on your, it's based on the energy labeling requirements in Europe. I guess you see it at least on some of them. It's all these A, B, C, D, and so on. But they are not supported by standards. They are actually in this directorate, they have decided to support the overall legislation with technical regulations or directives for the specific products. It's perhaps a bit also, it has perhaps something to do also with the culture. I think it's the DG for environment which is responsible for this legislation, and they are a bit reluctant to give the private sector, the members of the technical committees, the possibility of influencing how to do the energy labeling. So they have done it themselves, but the design is the same of the legislation, that you have a framework legislation and then you have specific legislation, in this case, not standards, but you have specific legislation for each product. What are the benefits of referring to voluntary standards and technical regulation? First of all, they have learned from the new approach directives that it is a very efficient way of regulating. The way it is done by technical committees with representative of interested parties ensures that it's not only the theoretical people from the ministries and from the public authorities who decide what to focus on. They also have a practical, there is also a practical approach or practical angle involved in this, in the development of these standards. So therefore, the standard is a compromise. It's not necessarily the best possible seen from a technical point of view, but it takes into consideration both the political and the technical issues and find a compromise everybody can live with. And then you have the continuous updates. In many areas, you see that the development of new technologies and so on is going so fast that it's impossible as a regulator to follow it. New test methods are developed, more precise test methods. New equipment is also developed for the laboratories. And if they want to show that you can use this kind of equipment as well, then you have to revise the test method standards. So this continuous update is done by a private system to support the public system or the public legislation. So this is a huge advantage. And finally, by having this dynamic approach, you also support innovation, and it's especially done by using these performance-based standards. Performance-based standards are, I have been touching on it, is the opposite of descriptive standards. It means they focus on the performance. They don't focus on how you do things, but you shall achieve something. And this is something which support innovation so that you are not forced to use a specific material, for example. Sorry. You are not used, you don't have to use a specific material if another material is better and it gives the same performance, and perhaps it even saves some money for the producer. So in that way, it supports innovation. We are close to an end. What about food? Food is not CE marked. food is regulated on EU level, but it's also regulated on national level. Back in 2002, a regulation was adopted laying down the principles and the requirements for general food law regulation. This is still the umbrella. It sets out an overarching and coherent framework for the development of food and feed legislation, both at union level and at national level. So as you can see, there are a lot of national regulation you shall take into account when you export to Europe. You can't just say, we just live up to this European legislation, then everything is good as it would be if it was a CE mark product. This is not the case when it comes to food. It is still possible in countries, we have a so-called, I think we call it an environmental guarantee, that countries can introduce specific legislation to protect health and environment if it can be justified. And sometimes you cannot agree on a level, on European level, and a level of safety on European level, which is sufficient for some of the countries, and then they add something extra in their country. And this is allowed. And this is something you, if you were an exporter to Europe, should be aware of. At the same time, when we introduced this legislation, we also introduced the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed, RAFS, which is copied also in Indonesia, in RAFS, and in other ASEAN countries. So you can see that you have found some inspiration also in this field. I'll not say much about this. I just found this nice from farm to fork principle we have for the legislation in Europe. The challenge in this system is that if you want to export products to Europe, then we shall have traceability so that you actually can find out where these products you put on your table, where they have been produced. There was recently in Europe, perhaps not so recent anymore, but there was a problem with eggs from a specific farm in the Netherlands. These eggs were not healthy at all. And but when they found out that they were not healthy, then they could track them down back to this specific farm. And one of the reasons why it was possible was that all eggs, they have a little stamp. Every single egg has a little stamp, which is actually used for traceability. This is one of the things which is a challenge when you, for example, work with geographical indication projects in Indonesia, that you should be able to basically to find out where has this product, cacao, coffee, where has it been produced? How can we track down to the specific farmer who has actually produced this if, let's say, he has used something, a chemical or whatever, which is not allowed? Then we should find out to track back. This is a system which is difficult to implement in many countries, but we have tried to do it in Europe, and this is actually the whole thinking behind this from farm to fork system we have now. What do they use standards? Yes, they use standards, or if you ask me, I would more call it specifications, because Codex Alimentarius, which is an organization under the UN system, Codex Alimentarius, or the old Codex Commission, they developed specifications for how to deal with different kind of products. So the publications of Codex Alimentarius is intended to guide and promote the elaboration and establishment of definitions and requirements for food to assist in the harmonization, and in doing so to facilitate international trade. So it's a tool to harmonize, so that we do not all make our own test standard for how to test for pesticides on oranges. We have one described in Codex Alimentarius, and we use it. And when we have made a test report based on this test method, then we know that it can also be used in another country. At least they understand what we have done. Codex Alimentarius does not cover all areas, but it covers food labeling, food additives, contaminants in food, pesticides in food, and risk assessment procedures for determining the safety of foods derived from biology, DNA modified products, for example, or allergens. It also covers food hygiene methods. This is the areas it covers. And then it developed, now I've written specific Codex standards. It is specifications for the different kind of products, for meat products, frozen, fresh, processed meats and poultry, fish and fishery products, and so on. So you should see it as a kind of a matrix where you have these areas are covered, these kind of products are covered, and they now go back again, and they take into consideration all these things like labeling and food additives and so on. So it is a quite tight system where you cover many different areas in these systems. And they also have, I don't know exactly how many specifications or standards they have, but they have a lot. And I know they are also used in Indonesia. So are standards supporting food regulation? For sure, these standards are. You can probably also find legislation also in Denmark where we have references to test methods developed by ISO, for example. But the main standards used when it comes to food safety, it's standards or specifications developed by the Codex Commission. Okay, time has gone, and it's just on time that I would like to conclude now. As you can see, this is a very comprehensive. I don't know if you have hanged on, most of you here, for 2 hours. It's a lot of words from one tongue, from one mouth. But I hope you have understood that the use of framework legislation supported by voluntary standards has been a huge success when we implemented the EU single market. I also feel that there is a good chance that you will see this system also used in the ASEAN countries. It takes time. In Europe, we are more connected on a legislative level than you are in the ASEAN countries. It means that you are in read. Your countries are also, the countries in the ASEAN community, they are also very different development-wise. So it's not easy to implement such a system quickly, but I believe that this is a system which will be used more and more. I see it in other parts of the world also, but I believe that in Southeast Asia, they will move in this direction soon. Harmonized standards, the standards supporting technical regulation with essential requirements, it's only used for non-food areas, not for food. The modular conformity assessment system, you have learned that it is it's in a way a very simple system. It also put a lot of responsibility on the manufacturer. He is the one who affixed the CE mark. He is the one who shall find out what kind of conformity assessment module he shall use. And then about the food regulation, it's only in direct use, you can say. It's in the national authorities shall find out what to do with the legislation, then they can find inspiration in the Codex system. Okay, listen, it's only 9 o'clock in the morning here in Denmark, but we have now spent 2 hours together, and there may be some questions. I will leave this for you. You can write down my email address. If you have specific questions, you can send it to me and I will answer as quick as possible. if you think that it could be interesting to hear more about this or that, which we have touched on today, then request for more in-depth training can be mailed to my good friend, Mita, at BSN. I put in her email address. I hope she will not complain about this because I haven't asked her. But you can say that we would like to know more about conformity assessment, for example, so that we can take it into consideration when we plan the next program, the next trainings to be under the project, under Arise Plus. We don't have a fixed program. Actually, every year we decide what to implement the following year. And right now we are in the process of planning for next year, but I think we will bring over a lot of activities from this year because of COVID-19 to next year. But still, all inputs, ideas, and so on are welcome, and then we will take it into consideration and try to meet as much as possible of your requests. So this is all I'll say for now, or for today. 2 hours has it taken, so I kept my time. And now I'll just wish you all a good day, or evening, afternoon and evening. And I will start my day now because it's 9 o'clock. Thank you very much to everybody, and have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you, Carsten.
Thank you, Carsten. Thank you, Bapak. Terima kasih banyak atas partisipasi.
Thank you, Carsten.
Thank you. Thank you for joining,
Bapak Ibu.
Ya, silakan jika ada pertanyaan dapat email ke Pak Carsten atau ke Ibu Mita, atau boleh nanti di chat, kami akan rangkumkan semua pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang sudah diberikan Bapak Ibu.
Terima kasih, Mbak Maya.
Ya, sama-sama, Mbak.
Terima kasih.
Ya, makasih.
Thank you.
Terima kasih.
Thank you.
Ya, sama-sama. Terima kasih.
Ini tidak double dengan becukai.